Maybe you're too young or too old to know what I'm talking about, so I'll explain first. Basically, somebody sends out an email with a subject line like, "Keep reading. Do not ignore." And then the message itself will contain some kind of short horror story. Something about how a schoolgirl was pushed down a well, and if you didn't repost it or forward it to X amount of people, she'd come crawling out of your toilet and drag you down into the pipes. Something like that. They all typically follow a similar formula. The first time I got one of them was back in middle school. Not an email, but a Facebook post that popped up on my feed. I don't exactly remember what the story was. Just that it terrified me enough at the time that I actually did repost it. Something my friends completely roasted me for after the fact. But hey, no demon girl ever came crawling out of my toilet. So who's to say I didn't make the right call? Obviously, the entire concept of these chain mails or scare mails was pretty dumb and juvenile. And most of the stories were so terribly written that they could only ever work on skittish 13-year-olds. But as dumb as they were still entertaining enough to engage with back in the day. It was fun to just fuck around and pretend they were real. Core childhood memories. So this morning I was sitting at my desk, watching YouTube while sipping coffee. My typical routine before work. Before leaving, I did a quick scan through my emails. Nothing unusual. There was an invite to a wedding, a newsletter from my old university, my boss complaining about some bullshit. But right before I was about to close my laptop, something new landed in my inbox. It was from an address I didn't recognize. Just one word in the subject line. Sorry. A bit weird. A bit concerning. Probably malware. I barely respond to the emails that I actually have to. Why would I bother with this? I ended up clicking on it anyway. Life had been a bit monotonous recently. Maybe this would prove to be something interesting. The message was only a few sentences long. I'll paste it below. One night, a woman was hit by a speeding car at night. The driver was intoxicated and did not call the police. Instead, he dragged her bleeding body down into the sewers and left her there to die. They found her body 2 days later and brought it into the morgue, where they cleaned her up and tucked her away. But when they went to take her out 2 weeks later, she was missing. Her empty body bag filled with stinking sewage. If you do not forward this to 5 others by midnight, she will be in your room tonight. She will seek vengeance. This is not a joke. You know what you did. I think I laughed out loud after reading it. I couldn't even remember the last time I'd seen one of these. What a blast from the past. Albeit a bit more intense than the ones I remembered seeing as a kid. But I suppose that these things evolve over time. I was still a bit perturbed that it had been sent to my work email. But then again, I work at a pretty big company and it probably wasn't a terribly hard thing to find. The email contained an attachment as well. A single PNG file named her. I just figured it was going to be some AI-generated image of a demon woman. An attempt at a cheap scare in order to prolong the joke. So I decided to humor the sender by opening it up. But there was nothing there. Just a plain black image. What a letdown. I didn't think about it much for the rest of the day. Work was stressful and I had to force myself to endure a boxing class afterwards. By the time I got home, I was ready to eat dinner and just pass out. After eating, I was lying on my couch, sipping sangria while messaging this girl, Elisa, that I'd matched with on Hinge. I was having trouble coming up with things to talk about, so I mentioned the email. She was about the same age as me, so I figured she'd get a kick out of it. Which she did. She gave me her own email and asked me to forward it to her. She wanted to see it. Just curious. So I sent it over. Then I put my phone down and went to go take a shower. When I checked my phone again, she'd sent another message. Holy shit, that's terrifying. I messaged her back something like, I know, right? I'm shitting bricks just thinking about it. But she told me she wasn't joking. And that she wasn't talking about the story. Look at the image again. And turn your brightness all the way up. Look closely. It wasn't exactly what I wanted to read before going to bed. But I went ahead and did so. I opened up my email and then re-downloaded the file. Then I turned the lights off and raised the brightness on my phone as high as it could go. I stared intently at the screen. It took some squinting, but I was able to see it. Elisa was right. It was absolutely fucking terrifying. You still couldn't see much, but you could see just enough. A set of floating teeth just barely reflecting the minimal light there was. The crescent shape suggested a smile. 2 eyes hovered above. Both of them were unnaturally wide, as if they were actively being pried open by unseen hands. Immediately I turned the lights back on. You know that feeling you get when you dig into your pockets, and your wallet or phone isn't there? I was feeling something similar to that, but with an added layer of dread. The details just didn't add up. Was the email a joke or a genuine attempt at a scare? It was too terribly written to be serious. But if it was a joke, then why was this image the creepiest shit I'd ever seen? Elisa sent another message, saying that she'd used Lightroom to lift the exposure, make the image as bright as possible. I stared at her second email sitting in my inbox before opening it up. And this is the point where any humor or nostalgia was completely sucked away from the situation. The image was still extremely dark, but enough details had been revealed for it to be somewhat clear that it was a woman's face. Well, kind of. More like something imitating a woman. Something extremely uncanny. It felt like my brain was trying to convince me that it was actually a mannequin, mostly due to the paper white skin. But the longer I stared at it, the less likely that seemed to be. Because I'd never seen a mannequin with an expression like that. Something so hateful, so evil. It didn't even seem possible for any person or machine to recreate. A smile was there, though the jaw was clenched, the teeth pressed tight together. The nostrils were large, flared wide open, each one like a shotgun barrel. The eyes were owl-like, stretched out in a painful-looking way. But the brows were drawn down, the skin furrowed heavily between them as if this person were actually supposed to be squinting. A contradiction of features. I don't know how else to explain it. I tried doing a reverse image search, but it came back empty. I know that's not definitive proof of anything, but I'd been hoping that at least an obscure art form would have turned up. The picture was just so odd and frightening that being able to connect it to something would have maybe settled my nerves a bit. Whoever had conjured this whole thing up was good, because it had freaked me out in a way that I really didn't like. I was standing in the kitchen, just mulling it all over when somebody knocked at my door. I checked the time, seeing 10 past midnight. Weird, but all right. I checked the peephole, seeing a cop standing at my door. Even fucking weirder. I opened it and immediately she asked me to step outside. No explanation, just this dead serious look in her eyes, as if she thought I was hiding a body somewhere. I asked her what this was about. Come. Now, she said, her voice now barely above a whisper. Just do it. Maybe I'd done something while I was blackout drunk? In any case, I obliged. As soon as we were out in the hall, the cop shut the door behind me. She gestured for me to follow her and I did. The first question she asked me once we'd made it outside to the parking lot was whether I lived by myself or not. I told her by myself. She took a deep breath, introduced herself as Officer Viana before explaining that she had been called over here to deal with a noise complaint. I knew who she was talking about. A guy named Sam living 3 doors down from me. Rich college kid, kind of annoying as fuck, but I wasn't the one who called it in. After warning him to shut the music off, she'd walked outside to leave when she looked over at the window leading into my bedroom. I live on the 1st floor and my unit's right beside the entrance. If you were about average height, you'd be able to see into it from the lot. She said that I hadn't closed my blinds and that I'd left my window open and that the streetlights were just bright enough for her to be able to see inside. She said that she saw the outline of a figure standing by the door, completely still, as if they were waiting for somebody to enter. She said it didn't look like a doll or mannequin, that she got the sense it was something dangerous. The entire time she spoke, she had a hand on her weapon, her eyes continuously darting between me and the window. I did remember leaving the windows and blinds open. It's a bad habit, but somebody would have had to break through the mesh screen in order to get in. I would have heard it. Sam's music bleeding through the walls would not have been loud enough to muffle it. Not a chance. And then I realized that I'd gone into my bedroom to reach the shower about half an hour before she showed up. I hadn't seen anything then, but what if I just hadn't looked? Honestly, I didn't want to believe what she was telling me, because if it was true, then what in the fuck was I dealing with? We were standing too far away from the building for me to be able to see anything, so I began walking over to get a look at it for myself. But Viana stopped me. "You probably don't want to see it," she told me. "For your own sake, I wouldn't recommend it." Her tone was earnest enough for me to believe her. I asked her what I was supposed to do then. She told me to just wait. She'd already called for backup, and once they arrived, they'd go ahead and enter my apartment and investigate it. It didn't seem like I had another option, so I told her all right. At this point, I'm still hanging onto skepticism, more as a coping tool than anything else. The backup arrived nearly 20 minutes ago, and they're still in my apartment. It was getting cold outside, so right now I'm waiting in the lobby. If anybody's wondering, no, I still haven't told them about the email. There was just no way. No way it could have been connected. But now I don't know. I really don't know. And I'm not sure what to expect from here. If anything else happens, I'll update. Right now I'm sitting in a police station. The sun's about an hour away from rising. A lot has happened. These have been the most stressful hours of my life. The cops spent nearly an hour in my apartment before coming back out. When they did, their skin was pale and their expressions were blank, detached, as if they were having trouble coming to terms with whatever it was they'd just seen. They told me that there was somebody in my room, a woman. She was standing by the door in a way that I wouldn't have noticed upon first entering. Wouldn't have noticed at all until I actually turned around to get into bed. So I asked them where the woman was now. They told me she was still there, still in my room. I had to process that for a moment. Then I asked them why the hell they hadn't dragged her out. They briefly glanced at each other, both looking really uncomfortable before telling me they weren't able to, as in they actually physically couldn't do it. I shook my head and told them I wasn't following. Viana wasn't the biggest person, but the other officer who'd arrived looked like he could pick me up with one arm and chuck me across a field. Again, they just told me that she couldn't be moved. They'd even tried using tasers. Nothing. She didn't react, as if she were a statue fixed in place. But they were absolutely positive that she wasn't a statue. I asked them what she looked like. They asked me if I was sure I wanted to know. That they could show me, but her appearance may cause further psychological distress. I asked them to show me anyway. It was a strange thing. In the back of my mind, I had already been anticipating it. But even with the evidence presented so clearly and irrefutably before me, there was still a part of me that refused to believe it. It was the same woman from the picture. Couldn't be avoided anymore. I showed them the email and then I explained everything. They asked a lot of questions. I answered with the information that I had. They didn't seem to want to believe it either. It was like we'd all entered the twilight zone. They confirmed a few other details as well, like how a strong odor of sewage had been emanating from the woman, that it looked like she had been severely injured. One of her arms horrifically bent and twisted, scrapes and cuts all over her body. They had only shown me her picture from the shoulders up, but she'd actually been completely naked. They had already called for additional backup. Once they arrived, Viana drove me down to the police station. For my own safety, she'd claimed. In the car, I asked her how they planned on dealing with this, what exactly they were going to do. She said that she wasn't sure, that there really wasn't a precedent for something like this. She was pretty obviously disturbed by it all, but doing her best not to show it. She then asked me who Jackson Smith was. I told her he was a friend that I'd known since middle school. Then I asked what the hell he had to do with this. She said that he had been the one that sent me the email, that I probably hadn't noticed because he'd first forwarded it to a dummy account which had then forwarded it to me. She asked me when it was the last time I saw him. I told her it was a couple of weeks ago. We'd gone out drinking. He'd picked me up and parked on a residential street a few blocks away from downtown and told me he'd leave it there overnight. The night had been a disaster. I'd fallen into old habits and blacked out. At least I assumed that I had. There was a lapse in my memories. 1 second we were taking tequila shots, and the next thing I knew, I was in the passenger seat of his car. I didn't know how late it was. Could have been 3 or 4 in the morning. All I had was a vague recollection of being in the car and then getting dropped off. I didn't remember anything he'd said to me or anything I'd seen. I was even too out of it to question why he was driving at all. That's basically what I told her. She just nodded. I tried giving Jackson a call, but he wasn't picking up. I then asked some mutual friends if anybody had seen him lately. Nobody replied until we had reached the station. Craig said that he'd seen Jackson at a gas station around noon, that the guy hadn't said much and seemed pretty eager to get back on the road. Inside the police station, I asked them if there had been any reports of a body going missing from a morgue. They said that's what they were currently trying to figure out. I was then led into an interrogation room. The first detective asked me a myriad of things. To give an account of my entire day from morning to night, whether I'd ever seen the woman before, if I'd ever heard anybody breaking in. He asked me if this entire thing was a prank that I may or may not have been in on. If I actually believed that the email itself caused the woman to suddenly appear in my room. Soon it became obvious that he was trying to bait me into confirming one of two outcomes. That I was either clinically insane or that I'd actually kidnapped the woman. But I could tell that I wasn't giving him the answers he wanted. That he was becoming aggravated. That he really didn't even believe any of this. But I just told him what I knew. What had really happened. After about an hour, he was replaced by somebody else. This guy actually shook my hand and told me his name, Detective Brito. The first thing he told me after sitting down was that he believed everything that I'd said. That I must have been terrified and confused and that I had his deepest sympathies. It was a refreshing thing to hear, but I could not believe they were pulling the good cop, bad cop shit. I mean, what the hell did they think I had done? Even if I had done something, why would I turn myself in? I asked Brito why he was so sure that I was telling the truth. Just to see what he'd say. Normally, I wouldn't have been so bold with a cop, but I was starting to lose my shit. He just smiled, told me that earlier in his life he wouldn't have believed it either. But a few years ago, he'd gone through something that had forced him to question his understanding of things. That now he was a lot more open-minded. I asked him what exactly he'd experienced. He said that he'd tell me later, that we should deal with this first. He proceeded to give me an update on the woman. The entire building has now been evacuated and the SWAT have been called. They still haven't been able to move her. She still hasn't said a word. Every now and then she'll turn her head or body, but she always remains standing in the same exact spot beside my door. Sometimes she'll be facing ahead and other times she'll be staring into a corner. He said that the FBI have started tracking the situation. I asked him to clarify what he meant when he said they still haven't been able to move her. He said that this is the part that nobody's been able to make heads or tails of. Given the evidence, they have to conclude that she's completely resistant against physical force, electricity, chemicals, sedatives, pretty much anything that they're legally cleared to try. She still hasn't displayed any aggression, so they're not sure what a bullet to the head would do. He said that one option that was still on the table was cutting the floor out from beneath her and then loading her into a truck. But that would probably end up being extremely annoying for me. I asked him about Jackson. He told me that they were looking for him, that his vehicle's been spotted several states over, but they haven't been able to catch him. At that point, I really wasn't sure what to say anymore. I think I buried my face in my hands, screamed expletives into my palm, which Brito didn't react to. I told him that I really needed to get some sleep if he wanted to get any useful information out of me. Then I suddenly thought about Elisa, remembering that I'd forwarded the email to her. I could feel a wave of guilt wash over me. I brought it up to Brito, told him that they should find out where she lives and send somebody over to check on her, just in case. He said that might be a good idea, that he'd call it in. But in the meantime, I was free to leave and I should go get some rest, that we'd talk again in the morning. I left the station and picked up a six-pack, then headed for a motel where I booked a room for the night. I'm exhausted on all fronts. I haven't changed clothes in nearly 24 hours and I can feel my skin sticking to my shirt. I don't know what to think. Quite frankly, I don't want to think about anything at all, which is where the alcohol comes in. I'm 4 deep now and it's all starting to feel a bit less real. I know I shouldn't be using it as a crutch, but I just don't want to fucking deal with this. Before trying to get some sleep, I sent my boss a text, telling him I wouldn't be in tomorrow, and then I checked my email. Jackson had forwarded me another. This time there was no subject. All it contained was this message. You think you're done with this, but you aren't. You think you've escaped her, but you haven't. You must pay. You must pay. If you do not forward this to 5 more people, the next time you take a shower, she will be in there with you. She will drag you down into something worse than hell. Something worse than you can imagine. You will pay. Update 2. Last night I ended up passing out on the motel couch. I woke up maybe about an hour ago with a dry throat, a sharp headache, feeling nauseous, which actually wasn't so bad, because at least it managed to draw focus away from everything else. My immediate instinct was to head for the shower, but then I stopped before entering the bathroom. I began arguing with myself in my head. What could really happen? The moment I turned the water on, she'd be right there behind me? It wasn't possible. But then again, none of this should have been possible. I decided to text Brito about it. Not sure how I was expecting him to respond, or whether he was going to take it serious. But he told me that he was heading over, to just stay put, and absolutely do not enter the shower. While waiting around for him, I started wondering about the logistics of it all. I'd never entered my room and the woman had never got to me. So what if I just never took a shower? Would I be all right? At the very least, I should have been okay to use the sink. I splashed my face with cold water until the grogginess had become something manageable. Then I made myself some instant coffee and stared out the window, tried to dissociate. Brito showed up a few minutes later. There were 3 others with him. One was a middle-aged man wearing a polo shirt, slacks. The other 2 were hulking SWAT officers outfitted in what looked like full sets of gear. The officers stood quietly by the door while the man in the polo shirt flashed an FBI badge, introduced himself as Stevens. His expression was hard to read. He was smiling, but for what reason I couldn't tell. It certainly wasn't friendly, but it also didn't seem malicious. Brito asked me if I had taken a shower yet. I told him that I hadn't. He nodded. Stevens then asked if he could look at both emails. I said sure and then gave him my phone. His expression stiffened for the 5 or so minutes he spent looking them over. But as he handed the phone back to me, the smile had returned. He said it was very important that I cooperate with what he was about to tell me next. I was going to take a shower while they monitored me. I'd shut the curtains, but they'd be there in the room with me. This was probably the only situation where I would have ever agreed to something like that. Even though I wasn't fully convinced that anything would happen. They told me that there shouldn't have been anything to worry about, since they still had a visual of the woman in my apartment. Apparently she still hadn't moved. And it was pretty clear that neither of them were really entertaining the possibility of her teleporting over. The prevailing theory was still that the woman had somehow found a way to enter my apartment without me noticing. How she did that, I couldn't begin to fathom. But I suppose that, in the absence of any other explanations, it had to be true. So I asked them what reason they had to want to monitor me. What were they expecting? They told me that they weren't entirely sure. But the situation was bizarre enough that it had forced the need to confirm certain truths. To test some theories. Suddenly there came this gnawing feeling that it wasn't worth the risk. After all, I could just take a bath. But was I only going to take baths from now on? What was I actually afraid of? The woman was still in my apartment. I had armed SWAT guarding me. What the fuck could possibly happen? There was no way in hell I was going to live paranoid, looking over my shoulder for the rest of my life. I needed to confirm something as well. That I wasn't in danger. That I had nothing to fear. The plan was to have one of the officers stand out in the hallway by the front door, while the other station himself right outside the bathroom. Brito and Stevens both turned away as I stripped down, entered the shower. Doing so felt ridiculous enough that it managed to inject a bit of levity to the mood. But then I turned the water on and that disappeared almost immediately, replaced by dread and uncertainty. It should have felt euphoric to scrub the dirt and sweat off of my skin. Instead, my heart was beating heavy as I stared down at the drain. I squeezed some shampoo into my hands and began massaging it into my scalp, though I continued to force my eyes open, keeping them on the drain. But soon the stinging became too much and I closed them for just a few seconds as I wiped the shampoo away. When I opened them back up, it looked like the water had taken on a brownish-green color. At first I thought it could have been the shampoo. But then I could smell something rotten floating through the steam. Suddenly the spray plate from the showerhead dropped to the floor in front of me. The stench intensified. Took me a few seconds too long to realize what was happening. I turned the water off and opened the curtains, but before I could step out, I could feel something grab my hair. I tried yanking my head away, but whatever was holding me had some kind iron grip. I couldn't move. Both Brito and Stevens seemed frozen in place as they stared somewhere above me. Their eyes were wide and their mouths were slack. They looked shell-shocked. I asked them to tell me what they were looking at, 'cause I sure as hell didn't want to turn around and find out for myself. But they didn't tell me anything. Instead, they yelled for the officer outside. The bathroom door swung open, but the officer stopped himself before entering. Though his mask was concealing his expression, his body language was telling enough. He shook his head, backed away. Then he ran out of the room. I could feel whatever was holding my hair beginning to pull me up, as if it were trying to rip my scalp off. Brito and Stevens continued to stand there, looking dumbfounded. I started to scream. But then the officer who had been out in the hallway rushed in. He also stopped at the doorway, hesitating for a moment before grabbing the knife from his belt and lunging towards me. Soon I could feel the pain and pressure alleviate, and the second I did, I leapt out of the tub. Once I was out the bathroom, I turned around to see a pale arm retracting back into the showerhead. It's been a few hours since that happened. A chunk of my hair's missing from where the officer had cut it off. My scalp's been bandaged up and I ended up using the sink to scrub away whatever sewer water was left on my skin. Mentally, I haven't begun to recover at all. I'm back at the police station now. I can feel everybody staring at me, though they all turn away whenever I try and look at them. A strange tension hangs in the air. Still no updates on Jackson. He might be out of the country by now. But they did give me an update on Elisa. They can't find her. She hasn't been in to work. Nobody's seen her. I know it's my fault. Could have warned her. But would she have believed me? Would it have been too late anyways? How the fuck could I have seen this coming? I've also learned that the woman is no longer in my apartment. From what I've heard, she disappeared right in front of the cops who had been watching her. They just blinked and she was gone. They think she's still in the motel. Somewhere in the pipes. I've deleted all my emails. Every single address. The cops insisted I do so and I didn't fight them on it. But then I received a text message. From a number I didn't recognize. I should have paid more attention, been more careful. I shouldn't have opened it. But I did. The next time you fall asleep, she will be standing over you. She will take you. No escape. No escape. No escape. Update 3. Right now, every passing second kind of feels like a slow march towards doom. I've been talking to a lot of psychiatrists who try and calm me down, lead me away from bad thoughts. It's clear that they're choosing their words carefully, but that they still can't figure out exactly what to say to me. I've asked for some coffee, but that request was shut down. Caffeine right now would lead to an earlier crash, they tell me. And they needed me to stay awake for as long as possible as they tried to figure something out. So now I'm sitting in an interrogation room while a couple of detectives watch me, make sure I don't doze off. They've given me some food that's supposedly good for staving away drowsiness. Oatmeal, eggs, mixed nuts, some fruit. A lot of water. I still feel pretty alert, but the day's really only started. The longest I've ever gone without sleep was about 28 hours. I'm not sure how long I can push that to. Every now and then they'll give me an update about what's going on. They sent a drone into the motel washroom, flying it up near the open shower head. The feed showed that the woman was still in there. Well, all they could see was her head. It was just crammed inside, her features compressed to fit into the tight space. Still nothing about Jackson or Elisa, but now they're telling me that they've found somebody who might know what to do. A specialist, they're calling him. He's already on his way over. They've framed this as good news, though it's hard to get my hopes up. I'll update once I find out what's going on with this. So the specialist arrived a few hours ago. His name is Luke. He used to be a computer science professor. Now he holds some vague position at DARPA. He tried explaining to me exactly what he does, but most of it kind of went into one ear and out the other. But I managed to retain the important parts. Ever since grad school, he's been doing some deep digging into an incredibly obscure topic. Viruses, but not the biological kind. Not malware either. He says that over the years, he's noticed eerie parallels between how viruses manage to proliferate themselves through any given system and the mechanisms behind real-world phenomena. Social influence, mass hysteria, dictatorships, genocide, war. The very concept of fear. I asked him if he was implying that the world was a simulation, that our existence was the product of some kind of extra-dimensional coding. He told me that in a very broad sense, yes, but that he doesn't claim to understand the layers involved, that he's not sure we're capable of understanding them at all. Of course, this was the kind of research that most respected institutions wouldn't touch with a 1,000-foot pole. So the vast majority of it was done independently, funded through his own 401k and a line of credit. The only platform that had been available for him to publish his findings on was his own website. And for decades, they just sat there, collecting digital dust. The few reactions they did get were nothing more than derision from fellow academics. He was mocked, chastised, but these things didn't do much to deter him. He just kept doing his research, kept publishing whatever he'd found. Then one day he arrived at a breakthrough. He found something definitive to focus on. The paranormal. Not just haunted houses or strange creatures in the woods, but the things that can't be explained by the rules that we've set in place. The things that break our understanding of the world. I asked him to give me an example. He told me about the cabin in the woods. Not an actual physical cabin. It was more akin to a predatory entity. A trap that would only present itself to those desperate enough to take the bait. He went on to say how it's not an uncommon thing for people to get lost in the woods. Hikers, backpackers, those running away from something. The woods are vast, foreboding, hiding a bunch of secrets. He told me to imagine that I'd been lost for days. Thirsty, starving, hopeless. Delirious enough that I don't question why somebody would build a cabin so far out in the middle of nowhere. Why it looks so new and maintained. I stumble up to it and knock on the door, but nobody answers. Then I try the handle and find it unlocked and I go inside. There's running water, fresh food in the fridge, but nobody around. Again, I don't question this. I'm just so relieved that the world's finally tossed me a bone. I then go upstairs and find a fresh bed waiting for me. I'm so weak, so tired. My legs desperately need a reprieve. I just need to recharge. A quick nap and I'll have enough energy to keep going. So I crawl into bed. However long later, I wake up in darkness and assume it's nighttime. But there's something wrong, because my eyes aren't adjusting to it. Then I realize it's because the darkness is absolute. There's no moonlight streaming in from the windows. I get out of bed and try maneuvering around the room. The air feels thick, damp. There's a heavy scent of earth and metal all around. Eventually I find the light switch, but it's not working. So I take out my crumpled box of matches and use them to navigate downstairs and out the front door. And then I realize that I'm no longer in a forest. The grassy floor has been replaced by rough stone. I see nothing but darkness in all directions. There's a dripping noise coming from some undefined distance away. I'm in a cave. How I got here I can't begin to comprehend. I panic and start running. But I have no light and nowhere to go. Only a few matches left. I decide to go back into the cabin while I come up with another plan. It'll be safer there. Once inside, I light another match, just to get a sense of the layout. But it illuminates more than I'd anticipated. Something I hadn't noticed before. People, standing all around me in the dark. Not moving, not speaking, just watching. They look normal enough, but the context makes their presence frightening. Sinister. Then one of them starts moving towards me. The cabin is a virus. Something that doesn't belong in our reality. A corrupted space that we have no answers for. Nobody knows who or what put it here, how it even works. Just that it was meant to disturb the order of things, to slowly break us down. It'd be fair to call it evil in nature. The woman was a virus as well. Our reality was the system she'd infected. Like malware, she spreads digitally. But unlike malware, she's unrestricted. Sentient beyond our understanding of the word. She has more control over our own reality than we do. That's why the cops couldn't move her. We're bound by the rules of the universe. She breaks them. I had to ask Luke to leave me alone for a while. It was too much to hear at once. Too much to take in. But already I could feel the fatigue coming on. I hadn't been sleeping well even before all this. We were pressed for time. If he had a solution, then I needed to hear it now. I called him back in and asked him if he had a plan. He told me that he did. So then I asked how much confidence he had in it. He said he was more confident than not. That on a scale from 1 to 10, he was feeling about a 6. It wasn't really what I wanted to hear, and I guess he could sense as much, because he told me that he was just trying to be as honest as possible. I took a deep breath, told him to go ahead and tell me what he had in mind. He asked me if I was familiar with honeypots, in a cybersecurity context. I told him that I might have read an article about it once, but that he should probably fill in the blanks. He told me that, in the simplest of terms, they were traps meant to lure in hackers. Something that seems real. Something worth invading. but ultimately nothing but smoke and mirrors. An isolated, heavily monitored system. He asked me to imagine that I was a thief roaming around a neighborhood for somewhere to rob. Then I spot a large, expensive-looking house with all of its lights off. I sneak into the backyard and find the back door unlocked. And then I enter. But I've been baited. There's nothing to steal in there, and all of the doors suddenly lock from the outside. I've now been trapped. I told him that I wasn't really following. He looked at the floor for a moment before saying that the cabin itself was the honeypot. The woman was likely meticulously designed to infect our reality. In other words, she can only operate within the parameters that our world is bound by. The cabin is not bound by such rules. It's as much of an aberration as herself. And what happens when two aberrations are forced to interact? He said he couldn't be entirely sure. Though he could make some reasonable assumptions, the most important one being that they would interfere with each other. What kind of interference that would be remained to be seen. Best case scenario, they would just completely shut each other down. He didn't talk about the worst case. Then he said that he had to retract an earlier statement. The cabin wasn't exactly a honeypot, not based on the strict definition of the word. Because we didn't actually need to lure the woman in there. We had the means to simply make her appear. And now I understood where he was going with this. The plan was for us travel to the cabin. We'd go inside and then I'd fall asleep. The woman would spawn in, but she wouldn't be able to operate in there. Wouldn't be able to leave either. Then they'd wake me up and we'd go back to the surface while she remained trapped there forever. No more emails, no more phone calls. The nightmare would be over. At least that's how Luke was trying to sell it to me. And I really wanted to believe him. I asked him how we were supposed to get to the cabin if it only appears to those who've been lost in the woods for days. He said we didn't need to hunt it down. Because years ago, somebody had managed to escape the place, navigating the dark caves for nearly 2 whole days before he'd made it back to the surface. They found him a few miles away from a public campsite, in a state comparable to catatonia. Breathing but unresponsive. His expression fixed in a 1,000-yard stare. But over time, he was able to come back to reality. Within a few weeks, he was completely coherent again. And he was able to give a shockingly accurate account of where exactly the cabin was. Not just the location of the cave, but exactly how you needed to navigate inside in order to get there. Which he told me shouldn't have been possible. Because the guy claimed to have been in pitch darkness the entire time. They had no answer for this, but it didn't really matter. I asked him how far down into the cave we'd need to go. He told me not far. Just over 200 feet in vertical depth. I just nodded. I'd never been in a cave. And I'd never really been interested. He then asked me how I was feeling. I answered honestly that the drowsiness had just started to settle in. I checked the time, seeing that I'd been awake for just over 15 hours at that point. He said that we better get going then, because it was going to take us at least 4 hours to get to the cave and about another 3 to traverse all the way down to the cabin. I asked him what we were going to do if the plan failed. If his theories proved wrong. He just smiled, told me that we'd figure something else out, but he wouldn't elaborate any further. I excused myself and went to the bathroom. I spent a long time in there just pacing around, intermittently splashing my face with water. I knew it was time wasted, but there were just too many thoughts popping up at once. It was hard to deal with. I was panicking, and then came the nausea. As I was dry heaving into one of the toilets, I could feel my phone vibrating in my pocket. I took it out. It was Jackson calling me. Final update. The longer I stared at Jackson's name on my screen, the more I could feel my panic fading, though it was just being replaced by white-hot rage. Suddenly, all the stress and frustrations from the past few days came bubbling to the surface. And now I knew exactly where to aim it at. I answered the call, and before he could even say a word, I screamed at him for a good 30 seconds, cursing him out, calling him every name under the sun. I took a moment to catch my breath, and in that transitory silence, he asked if I'd gotten it all out of my system. I told him not all of it, but just enough to think clearly. Then I asked him to tell me exactly what was going on. No bullshit, no lies. We were well past that now. The situation was completely fucked, and he owed me answers. He took a deep breath, and then he laid it all out. He told me that when we'd gone out that night, I'd blacked out bad. I was throwing up, acting belligerent, barely able to walk straight. It was severe enough that he was forced to sober up in order to make sure that I didn't get myself into any trouble. By the time he finally managed to pull me out of the bar, he actually felt sober enough to drive. He still considered calling an Uber, but ultimately decided that it wasn't worth it. So he led me back to the car and threw me in the back seat. By the time he'd turned the engine over, I was snoring, out cold. The drive back to my place was smooth enough until he turned off the highway and onto the residential street that was just a few blocks away from my building. He said that all the streetlights were out, and he had to slow down and squint ahead in order to be able to tell where he was going. It became so bad that he decided to turn his high beams on. There were no other cars around, so he felt safe enough to do so. But the moment that his lights came on, they illuminated what looked like a woman sitting on the road about a dozen feet away. She was hunched over, face buried in her hands. He said that he'd nearly jumped out of his skin upon seeing her, because she hadn't been there before he had turned on the lights. I asked him how he could be so sure of that since it had been so dark out. He just told me that he was certain of it. She hadn't been there. He got out of the car to go check on her, but stopped himself after a few steps. He said it was so quiet outside that it felt surreal. No wind. No distant sounds of traffic. Absolutely nothing. But the most disturbing part was that he'd thought the woman had been crying. Her head and shoulders were bobbing up and down as if she were sobbing furiously. And she continued to do so as he cautiously approached her. But before he could get too close, he decided to drop the issue. Maybe it really was a woman in distress. But his gut was telling him something else. That he was actually in the presence of something extremely dangerous. He walked back to the car and shut the doors. But when he looked at the road again, the woman was now standing, moving towards us with these unnaturally long strides. By the time that he'd overcome the initial shock of seeing it, she was standing right in front of the car. He said that there was something wrong with her face. Her features were uncanny, stretched out too far. He began backing up when the woman suddenly slammed her head viciously down onto the hood. And then she did it again, and again. He panicked and hit the gas, but she followed the car wherever it went, sticking to the hood like glue, continuing to bash her head. So he put the car in drive instead. The vehicle lurched forward, and the woman bounced off of the windshield, her body catching a split second of air before landing. He stopped and looked into the rearview mirror, seeing the outline of her figure sprawled out onto the pavement behind us. Unmoving. I was still passed out, so he just sat there in the dark and the silence as his mind moved a million miles a minute. He wondered if he'd just committed homicide. But given how the woman was behaving, surely he had an argument for self-defense? He began questioning how the woman had even managed to slam her head so many times with such force. Each one had sounded like a gunshot, each impact shaking the steering wheel. What the hell was she? Ultimately, he convinced himself that it was better to go out and check on her. Maybe she had just been wired on PCP or something else. If that were the case, then leaving the scene would have been a really bad look for him. He crawled over to his trunk and grabbed the crowbar he kept back there. He said he didn't really know why, because he should have been able to handle her without it. She looked to be about 100 pounds lighter than him. She should have also been dead. He said that the closer he got to her body, the weirder he felt. and he only understood why once he was standing right over it. It was a mannequin, realistic but still utterly artificial. He reached down and touched its skin, and all he could feel was cold plastic. This thing wasn't alive. It shouldn't have had the capacity to be alive. He tried picking it up and found that it weighed no more than 10 pounds. He went back to the car and stared at the dents that had been left behind on the hood. They were larger than he'd expected. Looked like they had been caused by a wild animal. Then he looked back at the woman/mannequin and saw her sitting up, staring at him. He got back into his car and drove away. A few minutes later, he dropped me off. He said that he might have been able to convince himself that it was a dream or a hallucination if there hadn't been very real damage done to his car. Damage he was forced to look at every day when he drove to work. He also knew what he saw, how real it felt. For the entire next week, he lived his life on high alert. He said that he wasn't sure what he was expecting to happen, but that he sure as hell didn't feel safe. But nothing did happen. At least not that week. Life went on as normal. By the time that the second week rolled around, he was starting to relax. He still couldn't stop himself from looking over his shoulder, but he was more willing to accept that it had just been a one-off incident. He had been dealing with something dangerous and abnormal, but he was free from it now. He'd escaped it. But then he got the email. He said that the dread he'd felt while reading it was something you had to experience in order to understand. The email by itself would have been ridiculous, but given what had happened, this just about drove him to a breakdown. I brought up the line about the sewer, how the person in the story had supposedly dragged her into one, based on his account of things that hadn't happened. I didn't mean to make it sound as if I thought he were lying about that part, but I did. At this point, I didn't feel like I could trust the guy. He sounded earnest enough, but I'd gone through too much to fully accept what he was telling me. He just told me that the woman was lying. He'd never tried dragging her into a sewer. There hadn't even been a manhole nearby. I asked him what reason it would have to try and frame him for something like that. What was the point? He told me didn't know, but that it didn't matter. Clearly it was trying to fuck with him, mess with his head. I then asked him the inevitable question. Why the fuck did you forward that email to me? He went silent. I repeated the question. He told me that he'd panicked, that he hadn't been thinking straight. I told him that wasn't a good enough excuse, that he had no right dragging me into this shit. Why couldn't he have just found 5 inactive addresses and forwarded it to them? He said that he'd tried that, but it doesn't work. They had to belong to real people. The email he'd sent to me hadn't even been the original. That one had stated that if he didn't forward the message, she'd show up inside his closet. So that night he had set up a camera to face the closet in his room while he stayed awake at a 24/7 cafe a few blocks away. When he checked the footage the next morning, he could see her face peeking out behind his clothes. It knows exactly what you're doing, he said. You have to follow the rules. It knows when you try and skirt around them. It won't accept that. It won't stop. It'll never stop. Then I asked him why it had to be me. A selfish question, but I still wanted to know. Why did he have to send it to me? He just told me he was sorry. I told him that wasn't an answer. Why me? Why did I have to be part of this? He then admitted that he'd feel guilty about screwing over anybody else. So I asked why I was different, why he didn't feel about doing it to me. He clarified that he did feel bad about it, that he hates himself for it, but that I had been there that night, that whether I liked it or not, I was part of this. I told him that didn't make any sense. I hadn't seen the woman that night. I wasn't the one that she'd first sent the email to. He said that I was naive to think that I was separate from all this, that I wasn't involved, that eventually it would have caught up to me, that she doesn't forget. I asked him why he'd bothered to call me then if he was just going to justify everything. Did he expect me to forgive him? Could he not live with this on his conscience or something? He said that he wasn't expecting forgiveness, but that he still owed me an explanation, that I at least deserved to know what had happened. I asked him why he'd waited all the way until now to do so. He said that he couldn't handle it anymore, that this was no longer worth dealing with. He deleted his emails. He'd stopped looking at his phone. But that doesn't stop her. She always finds a way. He's been seeing them written out on dusty surfaces or carved into trees. One time a barista had stared him dead in the eyes and told him that the woman was going to disembowel him the next time he went into a washroom before smiling and handing him his coffee. She couldn't be escaped. No matter what he did or where he went, she'd be there. He said that he's already put countless others in danger, and it's taken him way too long to realize that's exactly what she'd wanted from him, what she's been using him for, so he was going to put an end to it. But first he wanted me to know that he really was sorry, that he should have ended it the moment he'd gotten the first email and avoided all this. I told him not to do anything drastic, that there was a plan in place to try and deal with her. But he wasn't listening. I think I heard him scoff. He said that everything had already been set in stone the minute that he first saw her. Perhaps even before then. There was no point. The last thing he told me before hanging up was that this was not going to get any better. That I'd been warned. I left the bathroom and had the cops trace the call. They pinged him in the middle of some forest that was about an 8-hour drive away. They said they'd send somebody out there to check on him, but that in the meantime we needed to get going. That my eyes were starting to get red. They led me into a slick-looking unmarked SUV with large tires that was waiting outside. Sat in the back with me were Luke and a SWAT officer. It might have been the same one that had been there in the motel. I couldn't tell for sure. The windows were all tinted from the inside and the front seats had been separated so we couldn't see up there. This is all to say that we could have been on Mars and I wouldn't have been able to tell. Luke explained that the location of the cave was classified information, that I was actually better off not knowing. I just nodded. Once we started moving, Luke took out a small vial and dumped out a single white pill onto his hand. He offered it to me. Caffeine pill, he said. I took it, swallowed it back with water. I'd taken caffeine pills a lot during college, and this didn't feel the same. This felt a lot better than caffeine. I didn't question it. Luke told me to settle in, but not too much. We were going to be driving for a while. He asked me what my favorite movie was and then pulled out a laptop. We finished Gangs of New York and were halfway through Fight Club when things started getting really bumpy. It no longer felt like we were on a road. If we hadn't been wearing seatbelts, we would have been pinballing all over the place. At one point, the vehicle stopped and we could hear the driver getting out. He began arguing with whoever was in the passenger seat, and it quickly turned into something heated. I asked Luke what was going on, but he just told me not to worry about it. A few minutes later, we were moving again. Another half hour and we had stopped again. Luke smiled, told me that we had arrived. Then he asked me again how I was feeling. I told him I was doing all right, still alert, but that the pill he'd given me was starting to wear off. He said that was a good thing, that they needed to be out of my system entirely in order for me to sleep. We got out of the car and stepped out into the woods. Deep woods. The air was heavy with moss, pine, moisture, tall trees and dense foliage all around. I was surprised to find that we weren't the only ones there. Turns out our vehicle had been part of a larger convoy. 4 SUVs total. Stepping out of the cars were more SWAT, some others wearing FBI jackets and cargo pants. I asked Luke why there were so many people here, specifically why we needed so much firepower. He just told me that the FBI were here to observe, and that the SWAT were here to make things go smoother. I tried pressing him for some more information, but he didn't seem keen on giving me anything else. He just told me not to worry, that my safety was everybody's #1 priority. I sort of believed him. We ended up having to hike about another mile before we reached the cave. There wasn't an actual trail to guide us. So I just followed Luke as we pushed through the thick brush until we had reached the clearing where it sat. It was a wholly inconspicuous entrance. Just a slight opening in a rock wall. We had to duck down to enter it. Luke handed me a flashlight, though it really wasn't needed, because everybody else had one as well. Like I said, I had never been inside a cave before, but this was a far cry from what I had imagined. It didn't seem natural. Instead of jagged walls and narrow passages, it was a wide path that sloped down gradually. Not steep enough for it to be too difficult to traverse, but just enough that if you started running down, you wouldn't be able to stop. I looked around at the walls, the floor. It was just smooth, remarkably unadulterated stone. The air carried a faint scent of mold. It was a hard thing to make sense of, hard to believe. I asked Luke if they knew who had built this place. He shook his head, said that if anybody had built it at all, they didn't have the slightest clue who it could have been, or for what purpose. Every so often the path branched off, sometimes into 2, sometimes 3. Very rarely there were 4 or 5 or even 6 different directions to choose from. But I guess they had already mapped out the place pretty well because they seemed to know exactly where to go. Soon the fatigue had become a monster. I could feel my eyes starting to burn, my lids growing heavy. Whenever my vision would start to blur, I would squeeze my eyes shut for a few seconds before opening them again. I'm not sure if it really did anything. I'd never been so tired. Sometimes Luke would grab me by the shoulder and squeeze it, telling me we were almost there. A line he repeated for hours. When I asked him how long we had been walking, he told me he wasn't sure, that this was a place where clocks and stopwatches weren't able to function. After an unknowable stretch of time, the floor finally leveled out and the path opened up into a larger chamber. Based on the echoes from our footsteps, the place was absolutely massive. I could hear Luke take a deep breath before telling me that it was right up ahead. We walked a bit further and soon we could see it. Everybody stopped. I could hear several mechanical clicks and realized it was the officers disengaging the safeties on their rifles. The cabin itself was a peculiar sight. It wasn't some creepy, run-down place. It looked clean, modern. In any other setting, it would have been inviting. Luke told me that once we went inside, I just needed to follow him, to not look around too much. That as long as I did that, I didn't have much to worry about. I just nodded. I didn't have the energy to question much of anything anymore. Inside it smelled like dust, old wood, something else that was extremely unpleasant but unidentifiable. I did what Luke said and followed him close while staring straight ahead. But then we turned a corner, and I nearly had a heart attack when I saw somebody crouched by the fireplace, looking up at us. They were pale, naked, hairless. Their mouth was hanging open and a thick, oily substance was dripping from their lips. I asked Luke what the hell that was supposed to be, and he just told me not to look at it, that the SWAT would take care of it if necessary. A few more turns and we had arrived in a bedroom. One of the officers closed the door and then everybody gathered around the bed and stared at me. "Go on," Luke said to me. "All that's left to do is fall asleep." I put my flashlight down and took a long exhale and then moved forward, crawled onto the mattress. The sheets were cold to the touch as I pulled them over my chest. As I laid my head on the pillow, I noticed another one of the pale figures standing in one of the corners, and then another one crouching on top of a dresser as if ready to pounce at any moment. There were probably more that I just hadn't noticed. I did my best to ignore them. I closed my eyes, but despite being as tired as I'd ever been, I couldn't stop my heart from pounding. I tried performing some breathing exercises that I'd learned long ago and just barely remembered. But they worked. Slowly I was able to settle down. Soon I had passed out. And then I woke up, still in the cabin but not underground. Luke, the FBI, the SWAT, they were all gone. None of the pale figures were there either. I was alone. I looked down at my hands, then up at the ceiling. The air was warm. It smelled fresh. I realized that I was no longer tired. Not at all. Was this a dream? Or had I just woken up? I sat up and got out of the bed and stared out the window. The forest was a bright, vibrant green. Blue skies above. A pleasant enough scene, but immediately I could tell that something was off. It was the silence. Something so absolute that it couldn't have been possible. No wind, no birds, no insects. Couldn't even hear my own heartbeat. These details led me to conclude that this had to be a dream. It just had to be. Of course, I had never experienced a dream that had felt so real, so visceral. What was I supposed to do here? I tried slapping myself in the face a few times. But then I thought about where I was in reality and wondered if I really wanted to wake up. It might have been preferable to just hang around here. And then I stared, hearing something. Sounded like a continuous succession of quick, distant thuds. Getting louder, closer. Footsteps, I realized. Somebody running. Soon a figure had burst out from the trees, moving frighteningly fast as they sprinted across the clearing towards the cabin. Although I couldn't get a clear look at them, I knew exactly who it was. And then I heard the door swing open. I hesitated for a moment before opening up the window and jumping out. I looked back into the cabin and saw the woman standing still in the bedroom, staring at me. Up until that point, I had never actually seen her in the daylight, and I wish that hadn't changed. She looked like something sketched based on a hazy recollection of a grotesque nightmare. Large eyes recessed into the skull. No nose, no ears. Thin lips curled into a wide, hateful smile, as if she were enjoying my fear. But if this was a dream, then I shouldn't have been in any danger, right? Suddenly I wasn't so sure. I was almost certain that the second I started running, she'd be coming after me. So I tried backing away slowly instead. The entire time I kept my eyes right on her, ready to bolt the second she made a move, which she never did. Once I was far enough away where I could no longer see her, I could begin to breathe again. But then I thought about how strange that was. Breathing. Have you ever remembered breathing in a dream? Was that possible? I tried purging that thought from my head and turned around, began venturing into the woods. No idea where to go, but I felt more comfortable walking as opposed to standing still. I walked for a long time. I could feel the fatigue building in my legs. Felt so real. This had to be real. But it couldn't have been, because the cave had felt real as well. So then what the hell was this? My brain could hardly handle it anymore. I closed my eyes and dropped to my knees. Why the fuck did I have to deal with this? Why the fuck I had gotten so unlucky? Soon I could no longer contain my frustrations, and I began to scream. And I only stopped when my throat went hoarse, when I could no longer produce anything more than a croak. I stayed kneeling as I listened to the dying echoes of my voice through the trees. It had felt good, cathartic, but instead of dying out, the echoes became louder, and it was no longer my voice, something much more shrill in tone, a sound that made my hairs stand tall. Something was mimicking my screams, repeating it back in sporadic intervals, each one getting louder. I stood up and looked around, trying to pinpoint where exactly it was coming from. After a while of squinting through the trees, I saw it. Pale figure. The woman. She was sprinting right towards me, but in a strange way, as if her body couldn't keep up with the speed in which she was moving, causing her to continuously stumble forward like a crazed, wild animal. Still screaming, I turned and ran, doing my best to weave a path through the dense forest while ignoring the screaming. I was so focused on getting away from her that I hadn't noticed the sharp drop ahead. It appeared suddenly, without precedence, and I couldn't stop myself from running right off of it. I was airborne for a moment before I landed rough, tumbling down a steep hill until a tree broke my momentum. My head was pounding and my back screamed in pain. For a second, I thought I was paralyzed. When I realized that I wasn't, I slowly pulled myself up, stumbling down the rest of the hill before looking back up it, expecting to see the woman staring at me from above. But she wasn't there, and the screaming had stopped. I began to feel some relief before the frustrations returned. What the fuck was she doing? Trying to taunt me? I continued walking through the forest until I reached a small creek. I knelt down and touched the cold water and realized how thirsty I was. The water was clear enough that I was almost tempted to go ahead and drink from it. But I decided against that, simply splashing my face with it instead. It was so refreshing that I just continued to do it. That was until I felt something grab onto me. I wiped the water from my eyes and looked down to see a set of pale fingers wrapped around my wrist. Suddenly it yanked me down into the creek and I was forced to use my free hand to try and push my head out of the water before I drowned. But then it just yanked me down again. Harder this time. My face smashed into one of the larger rocks and the pain was searing, my mouth filled with the taste of copper. The grip was strong enough that I could feel my hand slowly sinking into the soil below. I grimaced, shook my head. No way in hell I was going out like this. I planted my heels into the ground and began pulling my arm back as hard as I could. But it still felt like I was stuck, so I panicked, began stomping wildly into the creek. I became reckless enough that I started stomping on my own hand, and while it hurt like hell, I didn't stop, because I could feel the grip beginning to break. Once it did, I was launched backwards onto my ass. I crawled a good distance away from the creek before looking down at my hand, and it was a gruesome sight. The skin was bright red in the early stages of swelling. A few of my fingers were horrifically bent, and then I could feel the blood leaking from my nose. I looked back at the creek and saw the woman climbing out of it. That horrid smile was still plastered across her face. I started running again. Sometimes I'd turn around and see her in the corner of my vision before she disappeared. Sometimes I'd see her head poking out from the trees ahead and I'd pivot and change direction. Sometimes I'd hear footsteps behind me which stopped the second I turned around to check. I didn't know how long I'd been running, but I knew that I couldn't go for much longer. My legs and lungs were burning, my head pounding, my nose, back and hand were screaming in pain. Even my spirit was beginning to dwindle. A part of me just wanted to lie down and accept whatever horrible fate that the woman had in store for me. But I wasn't ready to resign to that just yet, so I kept on trudging ahead. Eventually the forest floor gave way to a perfectly sheer cliff. I looked to my left and right, and it seemed to extend indefinitely in either direction, as if the world had been sliced clean apart by some colossal blade. I looked down, seeing what appeared to be clouds floating below. Clouds. That didn't make any sense. But then none of this made any sense. Maybe this wasn't a dream, but it sure as hell wasn't real life either. I turned around, seeing the woman in the distance, once again sprinting towards me. It had been terrifying the first time, but now I was just getting tired of it. Why was she doing this? If she wanted me dead, why didn't she just go ahead and do it? Clearly she had the means to do so, but then maybe she couldn't, because I wasn't actually awake. I looked down at the clouds, then back at the woman, still barreling towards me. I could try and keep running, but I had this feeling that it wouldn't solve anything, that I'd be running forever, and this shit would never end. I realized that she was trying to break me, that she thought I was weak. I took a deep breath and closed my eyes and stepped over the edge. The sudden weightlessness was jarring. My heart was pounding, and I could feel an electric jolt moving up through my body. But then came the numbness, the lightheadedness, and soon I could feel nothing at all. The entire time I was waiting for the impact, but it never came. Eventually, I opened my eyes and found myself suspended in a white void. It didn't feel like I was falling anymore, just floating in this surreal dimension that seemed separate from time and space. I remained floating there for a long while, which I didn't mind so much, because it felt nice, as if my entire body were enveloped in a soft, warm blanket. I could feel no more pain, no more anxiety. I felt at ease, as if this was exactly where I belonged, where I was supposed to be. Slowly, shapes began to materialize around me. Colors began to seep in. Then I could hear voices. I could feel myself laying down, my fingers gripping cotton sheets. I was in a bed, in a hospital room. I sat up and looked at my fingers and saw them devoid of any injury. I touched my nose. No pain, nothing swollen. After a while, a nurse came in and she seemed surprised that I was awake. I asked her how long I had been out for. All she could tell me was that I'd been checked into the hospital for just north of 40 hours now. Took a few hours more before they'd cleared me to leave. Physically speaking, there was nothing wrong with me. As for the mental side, they said they still needed to run some tests. But I guess I seemed coherent enough that they were able to put those on hold. The nurse told me to wait in the lobby, that somebody would be picking me up. When I got down there, I found Luke and Brito already waiting for me. They were both smiling. They told me how relieved they were to see me awake. I told them that I had a lot of questions, but there was one that I needed answered before anything else. What happened inside the cabin? Luke told me that once I'd gone to sleep, the woman had appeared at the side of the bed, bending so that her face hovered right above mine. They said that they tried waking me up, but I wasn't budging. Then they tried removing me from the bed, but they ran into complications, because that's when the entities within the cabin decided to start coming after them. For a short while, it turned into a shit show. Bullets were fired. Several people were injured, but no deaths, they assured me. One thing they noticed was that the woman never moved, at least not from where she was standing. They could see her body shaking as if she were desperately trying but unable to do so. Ultimately, everybody was able to make it out of the cabin. I was still completely passed out, so the officers alternated shifts